I'd like to speak a little bit tonight about a project that I have been working on at Cooch's Bridge with funding provided by the Friends of Cooch's Bridge Historic Site. And I'm going to use Johann Ewald as the sort of the leitmotif for this discussion. The title of the presentation is From Foot Jaegers Forward to Such Deep Sorrow. These are both quotes from Johann himself. Captain Johann Ewald's combat experience at Cooch's Bridge and the battlefield at Fort Mercer. I'm an archaeologist and an historian, so I've been able to work on both of these spaces in the recent past, in the last couple of years, where we've identified spaces that Ewald was involved in both of these engagements. I want to put a warning in right now that when we speak about the Red Bank battlefield, there will be images of human remains and discussions of violent death. It's not the intention to offend anyone here, but this is reporting on scientific and historical study. But viewer discretion is advised, so if you aren't interested in images of human remains, you might want to not either watch that section or watch the presentation. To give you sort of a background of a context of where we are in the American Revolution, the battle at Cooch's Bridge is fought in Philadelphia, or the Philadelphia campaign of 1777. And you can see in this image the kind of the location of Cooch's Bridge, the town or borough at the time of Wilmington and Philadelphia. The intent here was for the British forces, Crown forces, both Navy and Army, to take Philadelphia, which was the capital of the fledgling United States at the time. So an army of about 17,000 men under command of Sir William Howe, supported by the Royal Navy, land at the area of Elk Neck in Maryland on the 25th of August. General George Washington and the main army, the main Continental Army, of about 15,000 men. It varies depending on how many militiamen were attached. Advances down into the Wilmington area, and he pushes forward a light infantry corps that he sends out to the Cooch's Bridge area. So the Battle of Cooch's Bridge is fought on the 3rd of September, 1777. That is the opening engagement of the Philadelphia campaign. The following 8 days later is the Battle of Brandywine on the 11th of September, and then a short couple days later, the Battle of the Clouds is almost fought, but it is called literally on account of rain because of a nor'easter that blows in and damages the ability to fight for both armies. The attack and battle at Paoli, sometimes referred to as the Massacre of Paoli, is on the night of the 20th and 21st of September. More maneuvering occurs by the British forces and the Americans, and Philadelphia is actually captured on the 26th of September. So about a month's period of time, from the 25th of August to the 26th of September, British forces and American forces, Patriot forces, are maneuvering across northern Delaware and southeastern Pennsylvania. But the battle is not ended, the campaign is not ended, because while you've captured Philadelphia, you have no ability for a Royal Navy to come and supply the Royal Army, which is now there. So there's the Battle of Germantown on the 4th of October, followed by the Battle of Red Bank on the 22nd of October, which is the other engagement that I'll talk about here. And then the siege of Fort Mifflin in the Delaware River. By the time the siege is over, the British have opened up the river. They've removed the Pennsylvania Navy and obstructions and the fortifications that blocked them from being able to get into Philadelphia. So as I said, the leitmotif for this story is Johann Ewald. He was a prolific author and particularly known for writing treatises on military tactics. He was 33 years old at the time of the Battle of Cooch's Bridge, or the time of the 1777 campaign. He had served in the closing campaigns of the 7 Years' War in Germany. He had studied military theory in Germany. He was promoted to a captain in the 1770s. He arrives with the initial force of Jaeger and Hessian soldiers in 1776. So he had been fighting in North America for a full year before the battle at Cooch's Bridge. He's made a captain in the Hessian Field Jaeger Corps in 1777 and fights throughout the entire American Revolution. In 1979, his diary was published, Yale University Press, and the editor was Joseph Tustin. That book is available, and so much of what I talk about here, if you want to see his first-person accounts and his words, Johann Ewald's words are available in that volume called Diary of American War. He returns to Hesse-Kassel in 1783, moves over to be a Danish military officer by the late 1778, and that's the image that you see here shows him as a Danish military lieutenant general, and he retires from that service in 1813. So Johann Ewald is known as sort of his treatise on partisan warfare that he wrote is considered to be one of the major training volumes prepared at the end of the 18th century that pretty much any light infantry officer or kind of irregular warfare officer read. It would have been Johann Ewald's volume. The Hessian Field Jaeger Corps, which I mentioned, was about 600 men, and this is an image of what those soldiers would have looked like. So if you have the traditional view that these soldiers that are fighting here are scarlet-coated British soldiers, that is really not the case. In the case of the battle at Cooch's Bridge, this is the Hessian Field Jaeger Corps, which bears the brunt of the fighting on the day of the battle. They're about, as I said, about 600 men. It varies depending on whose account you're looking at. I'm giving them about 600. It might have been slightly less, maybe more. 3 infantry companies, 2 from Hesse and 1 from Ansbach, both small states or states that provided soldiers to the Hessian army. 1 mounted or dragoon company and an artillery detachment. So this is a fairly well-rounded strike force. And field Jaegers are considered to be your elite soldiers. They are armed with rifles, and so they carry short stabbing swords. They're armed with rifles. They cannot put a bayonet on a weapon like that. The force that they fight against is known as Maxwell's Light Infantry Corps. It was formed in late August of 1777 and disbanded by late September of the same year. So literally it only exists for about a month. On paper, that force should have been a little over 1,000 officers and men. It's probably likely that it never reached that size. It's sort of in a state of flux a lot, where it's gaining and losing militiamen and officers, etc., at different times over that period of that 1-month period. The commanding officer of the unit was Brigadier General William Maxwell of New Jersey. He was the ranking brigadier general in the Continental Army, in the main army at the time. And the Continental soldiers who fight here are from North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. There are no Delaware Continentals or Maryland Continentals who fight at Cooch's Bridge. They had not been part of the detachment when it was initially created. But there were Newcastle County militia and Pennsylvania militia who fought here. And among them were Brigadier General Samuel Patterson, Lieutenant Colonel George Craighead, and Major Thomas Duff. Also, it's likely that Alan McLean's entire company was part of this unit. Most of the time, soldiers who were assigned to this unit or detached to this unit came as individuals. They did not come as full companies. So there's sort of a logistics issue of how this unit can fight, given that it's fighting under officers and men that it doesn't really know, and you're just kind of pulling them together at any given time. It is a very aggressive, competent unit. It's made up of intelligent officers who have some veteran experience. Images that you see here show you on the upper left, Derek Lane, who was a lieutenant from New Jersey. He'll go on to be a founder of Rensselaer, New York after the war. William Heath is in the middle of that image. He's a colonel from Virginia. He had already served in the Virginia line and had been captured at Quebec in the late attack on Quebec in late 1775. He was captured and wounded in the right side of his face where he lost his eye. So you only see the left side of his face there. Alexander Martin of North Carolina was a colonel. He resigns his commission soon after this, but he'll go on to be governor of North Carolina. Francis Gurney was a veteran of the French and Indian War. He's a merchant from Philadelphia. And on the far lower right, you see John Marshall, who will go on to be Chief Justice of the United States, but he serves here at Cooch's Bridge. So there's just some of the officer corps that we know that were part of this group. And my own research on this, I have identified out of that perhaps 800 to 1,000 men, about 300 men that I know that served in this unit. And this is based on a variety of sources, but it gives you a rough breakdown of where these forces come from. Pension records, muster rolls, diaries, journals, other official records, other researchers who have shared information with me, county histories, etc. But you get a sense of the distribution of the men based principally on pension records and muster rolls. So the area that the battle is going to take place, you see an image from about 1910 of Old Baltimore Pike, which is down by Cooch's Bridge. The bridge itself is in the distance in that photograph. You can see it in the background. This area is identified by at least one of the contemporary officers, Walter Stewart, as an area that is formed by nature for defense, having a great quantity of woods, large morasses or swamps, inland swamp areas, that the British must pass through, and many commanding hills, which the militia may take post on. So the reason that this space is chosen is that it's seen as a fairly good defensive point for the American forces and a good sort of choke point to slow the British forces down. Now that American light infantry unit is intended to be an advance guard. Also, like the field Jaegers, it's intended to be made up of your most active, physically fit soldiers, men who can go out on raids and gather prisoners, gather intelligence, and get it back to headquarters. So there was a lot expected of the Light Infantry Corps, and over that period of the month that exists, it fights fairly well. So on the morning of the 3rd of September, the British forces had moved up to, over the course of that week when they landed at Elk Neck, they had moved up to the area of Head of Elk, which is today's Elkton, and they advanced along what is pretty much today's U.S. Route 40. There was a different road at the time, but essentially that's the route that they use. The battle is fought in a series of engagements where the Americans have prepared defensive positions and will fight themselves out of ammunition or force the British forces to deploy and then drop back to the next defensive line. And so the third of those positions is at the bridge itself, where the Americans are fighting across the Christina River. British forces are attacking at the bridge. The principal force engaged, as I mentioned earlier, is the Hessian Field Jaeger Corps. They will be supported by British light infantry battalions and eventually by British grenadiers who are likely to come into action. But the battle, as it initially is fought, is principally between Johann Ewald's corps, Field Jaeger Corps, and the Americans. And Ewald mentions this, where he says, "We had not gone 100 paces from the advance guard when I received fire from a hedge through which the 6 men, which were all on horses, were either killed or wounded. I cried out, 'Foot Jaegers forward,' and advanced with them to the area from which the fire was coming." So the engagement is brought on at this point. The Hessian Field Jaeger Corps deploys to attack the American forces. And as the descriptions come through from Johann Ewald, he says the Jaeger came to close quarters with the enemy, and the hunting sword was used as much as the rifle. So this is hand-to-hand combat. This is not just pot-shotting at people with your muskets or your rifles. Most of the American forces were armed with muskets, but there were also rifles intermixed with that force. The final of those positions that they come to is at the bridge, and Johann's commanding officer is pictured here, Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig Adam von Wurm, and he writes that after the enemy used up all their ammunition, we went after them with the sword and made them flee. They positioned themselves a second time, and we drove them again. This time they positioned themselves behind Christina Creek at Cooch's Bridge. Here the 2nd Light Infantry came to the aid. So what he's mentioning here is the British are he's referring to the 2nd Light Infantry, the British infantry force that's here. So who are the 2nd British Light Infantry? They're under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Abercrombie, who you see pictured here. I'm sorry, no, that's John Maitland, my mistake. Abercrombie is the commander of the 1st Battalion. The 2nd Battalion is the unit that comes into play here. Abercrombie's 1st Battalion tried to outflank the Americans to the east, but got stuck in one of those impassable morasses or swamps, and so was unable to be involved in the fight. A British light infantry battalion at this time is composed of the light infantry companies from all of the line regiments. And so in this particular situation, the 2nd Battalion is made up of a variety of companies, and you see them listed here. It was probably about 550 officers and men. So it's a fairly formidable force to be bringing into action, and like the Hessian Field Jaeger Corps, it is your elite infantry. So you're dealing with fairly well-trained infantrymen for both the Hessians that are being committed and for the British Light Infantry. And some of the accounts we have from here come from people like Congressman Henry Lawrence. Now, Lawrence wasn't on the battlefield, and so he's somewhat maybe angry or has some issues here with the Newcastle County Militia, but he mentions that they behaved infamously, threw down their guns and fled without stopping till they got home. And then Friedrich von Munchausen, who's aide to General Sir William Howe, also talks about a force of about 300 militia that opposed the battalion of light infantry. The latter, the militia, fired only one round, then left the field. That sounds bad for the Newcastle County Militia, but I think they may have only been carrying 4 rounds per man in the first place, and they're up against British light infantry forces. So given their ability to stop that infantry force, it's probably not out of the realm of the possible that they fired once and left. The other issue that they ran into was that their commanding officer was shot off of his horse and knocked senseless. And we know a little bit about that from a couple of the pension applications that we've got, and they talk about William Woodcock, who was from Christiana 100, says he saw a light horseman wounded in the arm and Major Duff's horse shot from under him. And another, Amos Pierce of Brandywine 100, says he saw Major Duff's horse shot from under him. The major was injured by the fall of the horse, and he recollects that a soldier named John Fletcher took him off the ground on his shoulders to a place of safety. So that engagement with the British Light Infantry was enough to injure some of your commanders and to be something that years later both of these pension applicants would remember what it was that happened. The death of Colonel Duff's horse seems to be something that appears even later in the records, and that he will apply for remuneration for the loss of his horse to the state government. So that leads me to a little bit of the most recent archaeology that we have done at Cooch's Bridge. And you see here the area of the West Cornfield that is west of the main Cooch homestead, which is the property that is now owned by the Delaware Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs. This area is in private ownership, and it has a conservation easement on it. So the only way we were allowed to be in here was to receive permission to do the survey and do the archaeology. This image also shows you the trace of Old Baltimore Pike, the former trace prior to 1814, as it headed up higher up onto the crest of the hill. It's shown by the dotted or the dashed white line. Within that red area is the area that I'll be talking about right now. And in that cornfield area, over the period of 2 archaeological surveys that we've done, we have recovered 38 dropped and impacted musket balls, rifle balls, and buckshot. The imagery on the left are the dropped balls. The images on the right are impacted balls. So just a little background, as a lead musket ball lead is soft, and so if it hits a target, it will flatten out, or it will lose its round shape when it hits that target. So you can tell an impacted ball because it's misshapen, whereas dropped balls that you see on the left, they will not lose their shape. And we think, based on what we have here, that the dropped balls are nearly exclusively all Brown Bess caliber, suggesting that they are British muskets, while the incoming shot, or the impacted shot, represent incoming shot, and they are almost all of the right size to be Charleville muskets or rifle balls. And so I believe what we're looking at here is that British light infantry attack line or battle line as it is receiving fire from American forces who are standing in around the house and perhaps across the creek, while the British light infantry force advances down onto the battlefield. This is an exciting discovery for the battlefield, because this helps, the archaeology helps us interpret an element of the fight. This is that final phase of the battle when the British light infantry are called into action and the Americans are attempting to slow them down. Other objects that were found at the same time include a couple coins, which you see on the left, and some buttons, a range of buttons, including a very nice pewter button, which almost certainly is a regimental coat button, and a couple others that are probably of the period. and would be related to the battle. On the coins on the left include a Mexican half real dated 1751 and a King George II half cent. The object on the far right is a sleeve link, or a cuff, what you might refer to as a cuff link, and I don't know if you can see the imagery on it, but the letters, script letters TD are shown there, and if you then kind of think back, this is speculation on my part and on the part of the archaeologists who've worked on this, but that sleeve link as a TD could very well stand for Thomas Duff, and Thomas Duff is our major who was unhorsed at the fight and knocked senseless and carried off the field by one of his men. Duff would have been a high enough ranking person in the community to be someone who would have sleeve links on his coat, and so this conceivably could be one of Thomas Duff's sleeve links. That doesn't have to be the case, but it's a possibility. And so after the battle, the site, the battlefield itself and the entire area is occupied by the British Army for 5 days. This is a map drawn by Major John Andre, who shows he drew it 2 days after the battle. And you can see outlined there that the British forces range from the top of Iron Hill down to what is today the village of Glasgow. They would have covered that entire space. The Cooch house itself is occupied by Lord Cornwallis as his headquarters. Prior to Cornwallis's occupation of the house, it was used by General Maxwell as his headquarters. So the Cooch property itself figures very prominently in the battle. It's the buildings itself and the farm complex are utilized. But the exciting part of this is that we have actually identified a major component of the battlefield. So at Cooch's Bridge, Johann Ewald was probably at the, very excited and very proud of the work his Field Jaeger Corps had done. That was the first time the Corps had fought together as a full unit, all three companies, the Dragoons and the artillery. He was clearly, with his statement about foot Jaegers forward, he was excited about what they did. They served well together. They fought well. His commanding officer gets recognition for what they did. The commanding officer of the Army, Sir William Howe, singles their corps out as having done a tremendous fight at Cooch's Bridge. And so, as I said, they stay in that area for about 5 days before they then move into northern Delaware, headed for the Battle of Brandywine. And now I'm going to move from Cooch's Bridge up to the Battle of Red Bank, which is about 8 weeks after the battle at Cooch's Bridge, or after they had landed at Elk Neck. And you'll see the change in kind of tenor of Johann Ewald from sort of the elation of the battle at Cooch's Bridge to what happens at Red Bank. Brandywine is fought, and it's a victory for the British, although it's somewhat pyrrhic in that they hold the battlefield, but they don't completely defeat the American forces. They outmaneuver the Americans throughout southeastern PA, and eventually seize Philadelphia on the 26th of September. The Battle of Germantown is fought on the 4th, and now the battle at Red Bank, October 22nd, is the space that we're going to move to. And you can kind of see them identified here as how far apart they are. The battle on the 22nd is followed by probably one of the worst Royal Navy disasters of the American Revolution, the destruction of the HMS Augusta and the Merlin, a smaller vessel. The Augusta is a 64-gun frigate that explodes in the Delaware River. This is on the 23rd of October, so the 22nd and 23rd are really, really dark days for the British forces. Fort Mifflin then holds out in a siege for about 6 days until it's finally literally blown into submission, beaten to destruction, and the American forces leave. When they leave Fort Mifflin, it makes the battlefield at Red Bank, or Fort Mercer, which is at Red Bank, untenable, and the Americans also leave the site. So I'm going to move forward to Red Bank. Red Bank Battlefield Park is a 44-acre park located in Gloucester County, New Jersey. It's maintained by the Gloucester County Department of Parks and Rec. and on the Delaware River on a bluff overlooking the Philadelphia airport and the site of Fort Mifflin, or the fort at Fort Mifflin on the Pennsylvania side. About 200,000 people visit this park a year, and it's got the James and Ann Whittle house that you see in the lower corner, and it's got remains of the fort and recreation trails. The section of this, what I'm going to be speaking about today, this work was funded by the New Jersey Historical Commission and by Gloucester County Parks. So to give you a sense of where we are, Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer are defending the Delaware River below Philadelphia. You see them circled here on the image on the right. The fort has a number of different drawings that have been done of it. On the left, you see one of those that show the way the fort was configured. The configuration of the fortification actually figures prominently in this battle, because the commanding officer, or the French engineer who was here, had cut the fort down by nearly 2/3 of its size, because the defense force that he had wasn't large enough to defend the entire perimeter of the fort wall. The commanding officer of this unit is Colonel Christopher Green of Rhode Island. There are 2 Rhode Island regiments in the fort. The 1st and 2nd Rhode Island. There are probably detachments of other soldiers, including some from the 6th Virginia, and an artillery detachment under the command of one of these recently arrived French officers, Captain Maudoui Duplessis, who is the engineer and the artillery officer who is responsible for cutting the fort down in its size. The garrison had about 600 men and was going to defend this fort to its last extremity. They were there to defend it regardless of what the assault force does. The assault force consisted almost completely of a Hessian assault column, a reinforced Hessian Grenadier Brigade under Count Emil Karl von Donop. You see him on the right-hand side image. Johann Ewald's corps, Field Jaeger Corps, is attached to this assault force, so Ewald is here. It's about a 2,400-man assault force, of which perhaps 1,400 of those men go into action. So it's anywhere from 2 to 4 to 1 odds that the assault force has. Von Donop had been charged with taking the fort, because if you could take Fort Mercer, you would make Fort Mifflin unusable. And so he decides to try to assault the force in a land attack that will be an assault. Infantry assault, not a siege. He's going to siege the fort, or seize the fort as quickly and as expeditiously as possible. He doesn't have a lot of artillery support. A small British unit that is there, 2 5.5-inch howitzers with a couple of his own Hessian Field Jaeger guns that go with that, or field guns that are attached to the battalions. The assault force is made up of the Grenadier Battalions von Linsing and von Minnigerode, and a Musketeer Regiment von Mirbach. This is the attack force that he sends in, and this is a disaster for this Hessian force. The attack takes place in the evening of October 22nd, after about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's about a 45-minute attack. The Hessian commanding officer summons the garrison to surrender, but they decline. They are told that if they don't surrender, it will be no quarter, and that all defenders will be killed if the fort is taken. And Christopher Green basically tells them, that's fine, we're here to take you on, and that's what we intend to do. You see here the assault columns and where they attacked, and you can also see in this image, which was prepared by another one of the French soldiers or French officers attached to Villefranche. He draws the fort where it's identified as red. The space that's identified as Red Bank is really the abandoned section of the fort. That smaller section off to the left, that's the piece that the American forces use as the sort of a citadel or defense space. So when the Minnigerode Battalion and the Mirbach Battalion assault the fort from the north and the east, they come over those outer walls and think they have won the battle. There is no defense force inside there, or a small unit that just returns fire and then abandons the walls. When they get into that space, they are fired on by the defenders inside the fort and by Pennsylvania naval vessels that are sitting out in the Delaware River. this attack is over an earthen embankment. So the fort at Red Bank did not have a fort wall that went along the riverside. The river sits about 30 or 40 feet, you're about 30 to 40 feet above on a bluff here, above the river. The defensive wall is on the inside or the land side of the fort. That little red mark is the location where in 2022 we identified the remains of approximately 15 what we believe are Hessian soldiers who were buried in the fort ditch after the battle is fought. The American casualties here are 14 killed and 21 wounded. The Hessian casualties are 151 dead and 266 wounded. This is a disaster for the Hessian forces. They are caught in that crossfire from the fort as well as from the garrison, as well as from the naval vessels that are firing into them. And Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig Johann von Wurm, who we met at Cooch's Bridge, writes the statement, "It's painful for me to lose so many good people." He is not directly engaged in the fight. The Field Jaeger Corps is used to try to keep the Pennsylvania naval vessels at bay and to keep the heads down of the garrison as they can, because the Jaegers are armed with rifles, they have a longer range. But they do not come into the actual assault force. So Johann Ewald is here, but he is not directly involved in the assault. But this loss, this is a tremendous loss. Probably it is considered to be the worst loss of any Hessian battle in the American Revolution. So the area that we were looking at, where we just did archaeology in 2022, is shown and identified here, outlined in red, as project area. The green area that you see below that is the current, or at the time, what was Red Bank Battlefield Park. That red section has now been added to the park. And so it now is incorporated inside the fence line of the park. You can see in the photograph, in the distance, the fortification ditch still is in existence, and you can still understand where the fort went. Where we were working was in an area where the ditch was much flatter and harder to identify, and it suggested that the fortification ditch was still something that archaeologically we could investigate and try to see, learn something about how the fort was built and what this section of the property looked like. We were doing this as a public archaeology project, and because the county wanted to understand what it had on this newly acquired quarter-acre lot. We knew that the section of the ditch of the fort in the 1930s had been enhanced by the WPA. We don't know exactly what they did because their paperwork is difficult to find. And you are in the borough of National Park. So this was just on the edge of the park, edge of the battlefield park in the borough of National Park. This image gives you a good idea of what we identified in terms of the fort ditch and in terms of the wall. The young woman that you see in the picture on the right, she's at the top of the scarp wall of the fort. That's the inside edge of the fort wall. The outline, the two red lines identify where the bottom of the fort ditch is, and it's about 13 feet across. And to understand how this fort was built, all the dirt that would have been in that ditch would have been used to build a fortification wall that would be behind where the young woman is sitting. The yellow stars that you see identify the locations of crania or skull elements that we recovered in the bottom of the fort ditch. Hessian losses here, we do have statements such as Johann Ewald from his journal, where he mentions these are the damages, the wounds that he saw from soldiers who came back with them after the battle was over. So these are men who made it back to Philadelphia but were not left on the battlefield. I take that back, some were left, including Colonel von Schick, who was the commanding officer of the Mirbach Regiment, who was killed and left on the battlefield, and the commanding officer of the assault force, von Donop, was also left on the battlefield, and he's mortally wounded and will die several days after the battle. But the wounds that are identified here by Johann Ewald are pretty remarkable and kind of staggering when you read these. And it's one thing to read them, but it's another thing to recognize that this range of wounds is what we were beginning to see in the bottom of the fort ditch. So he says things like right leg shot off, both legs shot to pieces, shot through both legs, shot through the chest and right arm, through the leg, in the arm, right arm shot off, through the left leg, through the neck and head, left foot smashed, right leg shot to pieces, right knee smashed, and in the left knee. Those are pretty horrendous wounds and would leave some pretty kind of horrible scars on men who made it back who were wounded. So remember, these are the wounds he identified, not the men who were killed on the battlefield. We also have, as sort of a material culture record, an object that was in private hands, but is a powder horn fragment, or a powder horn from a man who served in the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, John Burlingame. And his illustration here is of the battle at Red Bank. And so in his sort of primitive drawings that you see, he identifies decapitated bodies. He identifies soldiers who are missing legs. He identifies arms. He identifies very much in his drawing, in this rather primitive sketch, the same sorts of damages that we were seeing in the bottom of the fort ditch. This is, when you look at this, we sort of absorb this as, you know, these powder horns often had fanciful drawings and things on them. So at first glance, you might think that he's simply identifying, you know, just something he's making up. But that is not what is going on here. We have another image of it, and you can see it in a different way. The same sorts of damages and things that are shown. So what kind of armament could cause that kind of damage? And we need to go back to not just the garrison and its rifles and muskets and smaller cannon, but the fact that the Pennsylvania Navy is firing into this assault force. And the map that you see on the right-hand side is actually from Johann Ewald, and this is one that he prepared after the battle. But he shows vessels, naval vessels, firing into the assault force. And you see a list of the armaments of those Pennsylvania naval vessels. They're all galleys. They're row galleys. They sit low in the water. They only carry one cannon. But all those guns are from an 18-pounder cannon to one of them is a 32-pound gun. That's the size of a solid round ball that they would fire, the weight of a ball. So an 18-pound ball to a 32-pound ball. They are firing into the flank of the and rear of those assaulting German forces. They will not be using, however, solid round shot to do this. Instead, they are going to be using chain shot and bar shot. And we know this because at least one of the Hessian officers who was here talks about the fact that 2 ships which could not be seen fired chain shot into the flank. The latter knocked down whole rows of men. An image of chain shot you see in the upper right corner. It is 2 cannonballs linked by a chain. In a naval vessel, that's a great object to use, or a great type of shot to use to take down ships' masts or remove rigging. In an anti-personnel situation, that's exactly good for, if you will, taking off legs, arms, and heads. And that's what we see in the bottom of the fort ditch. So here are a couple of the images of some of the sets of human remains that we uncovered as we did the project. The image in the center shows one of the sets of human remains that is probably as complete as we have. That is currently identified as number 7. He is laying face down along the edge of the fort wall. You can see the back of his skull and his some elements of his cervical vertebra are there. He was hit by a iron grape shot, by a lead canister, and by a musket ball that we know were lodged in or in association with his body. On the both right and left, you see the images of some of the long bones that we recovered. The long bones were in very bad condition. It was very difficult to get a lot of good information from them, but all of this was excavated. We did the excavation work under the direction of the New Jersey State Police forensics anthropologist who you see shown here, Anna Delaney. And right now, the sets of human remains are with the New Jersey State Police Forensics Lab, and they are part of the custody. They're holding custody, which is probably the safest and most secure place that these remains could be. We also had a number of situations where you can see a musket ball in direct association or in close association to the human remains. You see both identified here, musket balls next to the long bones. These do not seem to indicate that the bone itself is fractured by that ball, but it probably lodged in soft tissue. So what do we know so far about this work? We know that there are 15 minimum number of individuals. They are all male, young, early to middle aged. Right now the evidence suggests that they are all of European descent. The bone is in fair to poor preservation. They were about 4.5 feet down in the bottom of the fort ditch and not buried with any particular ceremony, but kind of thrown into that space. We do have well-preserved teeth, which are going to really help us with trying to understand stable isotope analysis, chemical analyses, DNA analyses, all of which are ongoing and are being funded by various organizations to do this work. It's a remarkable site. From an American Revolution standpoint, there are very, very few battlefield dead that have ever been excavated. You could probably count the number on maybe 2 hands. Most recently, some work has been done down at Camden Battlefield in South Carolina, but our work in 2022 is probably one of the largest assemblages of battlefield dead burials that there are. Not hospital dead, but battlefield dead. In terms of weaponry, we identified 20 impacted musket balls, all of which are from the Charleville muskets, or from the right size to represent Charleville muskets, which suggests that the garrison is armed exclusively with French, recently imported French muskets. So those Rhode Island regiments have received those weapons by this point. We have one unfired musket ball, which is a slightly larger caliber, and suggests it's probably coming from one of the Hessian Grenadiers or Mirbach regiment. It probably was in someone's pocket. There's still some evidence of black residue or possibly gunpowder on the outer edges of the musket ball. We also recovered some grape shot, lead canister shot, gun flints, and at least one gun screw. You see pictured here the impacted musket balls that were found, or some of the impacted musket balls. The battlefield material really only consists of about 100 artifacts that are down at the same excavation level as where the human remains were found. But among those things, we have recovered a lot of clothing-related objects, including buttons, knee buckles, clothing hooks, some sleeve links, and some of those fragments of buttons, or the buttons actually have fragments of fabric and leather on them. These will be conserved and are in the process of conservation, and we will be doing analyses of a number of these different elements to see if we can recover other things from these as well. Knee buckles have produced some blood residue, for example. Some of the buttons have done the same. Just in speaking about the buttons, they all look similar to the one on the left-hand side, with the exception of 2, I should add. They are this type of button, and the uniform coat you see shown on the right is actually from a museum quality coat that is from the army of Frederick the Great, and those buttons look identical to the buttons that we have. I'm not arguing that the Prussians fought here. What I'm saying is that the Hessians were using a button style that is still readily available and can be seen on coats that are in existence in other places. So we're going to follow up on these elements of the coat buttons and things to try to understand who these buttons belong to. We did recover a King George III guinea, a gold guinea, and it raises all kinds of questions, like is it the object itself, that guinea, is worth more than the average wages for a Hessian private, and did it belong to an officer? Is it hidden in a coat? Hidden in a boot? Was it a keepsake or perhaps a good luck piece? In general, when bodies in the 18th century are buried on a battlefield, any usable objects are stripped from those bodies, since that would be coats, that would be shoes, boots, trousers, anything that you can use. Certainly any of the weaponry would have been taken as well. So to have a button or a coin like this still left in sight is really unusual and requires some level of explanation. We need to figure out why would this even be on the battlefield. If you were pulling objects and things from the bodies and you found a gold guinea, you certainly would have pocketed that gold guinea if you could. Our next steps are underway right now. We actually have done x-rays and CT scans of all of the sets of crania that we have. So the mandibles and the maxilla have all had that done. We have sent samples off for DNA. We will be doing sampling of stable isotope, which might help us understand diet and location where these soldiers came from. We've done some blood residue analyses at this point, which is actually pretty exciting because it's showing that there is blood on a number of these objects. That these objects are testing positive for blood, let me put it that way, which that in itself could be another source of identifying DNA. The battlefield artifacts or the battle-related artifacts are in process. We'll be doing conservation of those, and we've now started on a new component of this, is to really dig much more deeply into the military history of the units that fought here, using that information to try to understand genealogy and ultimately the land use history. How did this property get used over time? The ultimate goal here is going to be reinterment and commemoration of these soldiers. These men were buried in this ditch rather unceremoniously. There was no indication that anybody ever intended to relocate them or find them. So after some 240 years, we have been able to relocate these soldiers. We have reached out to the German government and are in conversation with elements of the government to try to work on reinterment, dignified reinterment and respectful reinterment. We would argue that they could be placed back in the space from which they came or in that area. Certainly if there is repatriation that might be suggested, that could be done as well. One of the exciting things that we're going to be doing is digital facial reconstruction, and the police forensics lab have actually agreed to do this. We have 2 of our crania sets or skulls that are full enough that we can do this. And so soon I think you will be able to see a face on some of these unknown soldiers that we have, and that's going to be very exciting to be able to see. These are men that Johann Ewald probably would have known, but their faces have been lost to time. This whole project has been a very interesting undertaking, and so at about the same time that we announced this, it's received international recognition. And Ewald, the whole idea that the Hessian forces were here, we have a lot of the documentation, but the physical evidence of what we have is exciting. Ewald, I'll come back to a statement that he makes, but I wanted to put this in here because this came out, an op-ed piece by Roger Cohen in September of 2022, about a month after we announced what we had found at Red Bank. And he's actually referring to unmarked graves or mass graves in the Ukraine. So this is contemporary discussion where he writes, "Every culture wants to memorialize its dead. Every family needs the missing to be identified to reach closure. Perhaps that is why a wartime mass grave offends something so deep in the human conscience. Any mass grave demands our humanity. The reconstitution of the individual's lives ended here." This is essentially what the goal of our Red Bank Battlefield project is. It's an ongoing project that we're continuing to do these analyses and to try to bring closure to who these soldiers were. As I said, many of these soldiers disappeared into this grave. They were never intended to be found again. They were not marked, and they were lost through time. Which pulls me back to Johann Ewald and a comment that he made. You remember his kind of elation at Cooch's Bridge, how well he had done, how well his Jaeger Corps had served. We now see something only a few months later where he says, "The defeat at Red Bank was especially sad for me. I lost 5 of my oldest friends, and 4 of my best friends were severely wounded. As long as I have served, I have not left the battlefield in such deep sorrow." So you see sort of the highs and lows of military action in the American Revolution played out by one soldier who fought at both of these locations. And it's the linkage between Johann Ewald to these places that allows us to kind of put this story together. The physical evidence we've seen at Cooch's Bridge and the battle that happens there, and the physical evidence we've seen of the disaster of a Hessian assault at Fort Mercer in October of 1777. So, as I mentioned earlier, this project was funded by grants from the New Jersey Historical Commission and by the county. And I want to just point out that the project team that we've had here, I identified Anna Delaney, but my co-director on this is Jen Janofsky, who is a professor at Rowan University in Public History and also the site director at Red Bank Battlefield Park. We've also had a number of other archaeologists involved, including Dana Link, Tom Christ, dentist Stuart Alexander, and a number of other professional archaeologists who have been involved. So it's very much a team effort. We have an amazing group of volunteers that have been working on this project as well. So it's very much a group effort to produce this project and to make this project happen. I would like to just kind of announce a really exciting find we have at Cooch's Bridge, which is that we've identified a African-American soldier, or an African-American who fought at Cooch's Bridge. This has been a kind of a quest for me for a long time. I've had a number of researchers and others, locals, historians, local historians, amateur historians, who've asked me, do we know where any African-Americans are fighting at Cooch's Bridge? And given the nature of the Light Infantry Corps that fought here, it's not easy to always know that. As I've mentioned in other presentations, Maxwell's Light Infantry only existed for about a month, and trying to reconstitute that corps is not an easy undertaking. But this is pretty exciting information. This is pictured here, and I would love to actually have a photograph of Benjamin Harris Martin, but instead I have the man who held him in bondage, and that is Alexander Martin, who was the colonel of the North Carolina Continentals who fought at Cooch's Bridge. Cooch's Bridge battle is fought on the 3rd of September, 1777. 40 years later, in Alexander Martin's will, he identifies a man who was with him at Cooch's Bridge who fought there. Alexander Martin goes on to he resigns his commission in the Continental Army. He goes on to be governor of North Carolina and a large enslaved labor owner, and someone who, because of his status, was a fairly high status person in North Carolina. His early life, he actually went to West Nottingham Academy in the region, in our region here, and may have actually attended New London Academy, which is the precursor to the University of Delaware. His later education is at Princeton University, or Princeton College at the time, and then he moves down to North Carolina. So early in his life, he was familiar with the area of Maryland, Delaware, Chester County, New Jersey. In his will, in 1807, he identifies several individuals he singles out to essentially award them their freedom at the time of his death. One of these men is Benjamin Harris Martin, and he notes that his service entitles him to this favor from his great fidelity to me in his private capacity, but, quote, when his public services are considered, they must be deemed highly meritorious by his country. Martin goes on to say, it is well known, and I hereby certify that he, Benjamin Harris Martin, served his country 3 years in the Continental Service under my command faithfully and with the reputation as a soldier. He further goes on and says, the poor fellow, being a humble friend, companion, and servant, bravely risked his life to obtain from British domination for his master and country, which liberty he was incapable of enjoying the benefits. So Governor Martin, or by this point Alexander Martin, ex-governor, feels it's important enough to provide the freedom to Benjamin Harris Martin for something he did 40 years earlier. Benjamin Harris Martin, is an enslaved person, and in many situations you're going to have officers from throughout the Continental Army who probably had enslaved individuals with them on the battlefields or in the camps, but in this case, he identifies this man as someone who has the reputation as a soldier. That almost certainly implies Benjamin Harris was not just on the battlefield in the camp. He was on the active battle line fighting with Alexander Martin. That's a pretty exciting statement because we haven't been able to find this sort of an individual anyplace else. I haven't seen this in any of the other records yet. It makes me think we should be going back and checking every one of those Virginia and North Carolina, even New Jersey officers who came and served at Cooch's Bridge, because perhaps there are some others. We would not have known this. This man, Benjamin Harris Martin, will not show up in a muster roll. He will not show up in a pension record because he's not identified as a soldier. Only Alexander Martin is identifying him as served as a soldier. This is exciting for us at Cooch's Bridge. It still leaves a lot of unanswered questions. Alexander Martin leaves Benjamin Harris Martin land, cattle, or livestock farming implements, and frees his wife and his children, so that this is essentially the beginning of a life for Benjamin Harris and Benjamin Harris Martin and his family. But at the same time, Alexander Martin is willing enslaved workers to other members of his family. So we have a real juxtaposition here of someone who wants to recognize the service of an enslaved man who was with him during the war, but at the same time isn't apparently willing to recognize the humanity of other people that he still has enslaved, that he is passing down to other members of his family. But in terms of excitement for us at Cooch's Bridge, this is really cool. This is like, it took me a long time to find this. This is not the kind of a record that just pops out. It takes time to kind of pull these threads and find this piece.